Hi everyone. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to show you guys 3 ways that you can use images to create cool meshes in Blender. So make sure you're in the Cycles render engine. The next thing we're going to need is a basic lighting setup. I use a plugin that just allows me to grab them from the internet. The first way that we're going to do this is through the use of subdivisions. So what I did to start out with is I took a plane and I subdivided it, and then I added a subdivision modifier on top of that. If I bring up this bottom bar, we're just going to separate this so on the top we can see our image, and then on the bottom we have our shader editor. This could be a picture you took on your phone, you got from a texture website, doesn't really matter. This technique will work with anything. So just starting out, this is what we have. We have no geometry, all we have is color data. So how do we turn this color data into something that would cast shadows if light was shown across the surface? Well, the first thing we're going to do is open up this amazing program called Materialize. It is an absolutely free program. I use it on every project now. It's fantastic. I'll go to my textures. I'm going to grab the brick texture. I will select that. And this second one is the diffuse. So this is what's driving the color data. Click on Create Height Map. And as you can see, we kind of have a slider at the top. I won't go too in depth over these settings because at default they're very good. You can fine tune them depending on the project. After clicking Set as Height Map, we have saved this as another image type for us to use. So what we can do is click on Show Material. It will show us kind of like a preview of what we're going to see in Blender. But as you can see, just from that base image, we're already getting a ton of really good mesh data. So what we can do now is click S for save. Now back into Blender, we're going to take advantage of this displacement slot. Now we have our height texture. So this is, I spelled map wrong. That's how you know this is an original texture, as it's spelled wrong. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a displacement node, and this displace will go here. This color will go into the height, and then we're going to switch the color space just to non-color because, again, this data is non-color data. As you can see, we're not getting a ton of height information. It almost looks more like a normal map. So what you have to change is you have to go into your material properties, then go down to settings and switch displacement from bump only to displacement and bump. And what that's going to do, as you can see, is it's allowing us to get displacement data out of our image. We're going to come down to this scale level, and this is what we can fine tune. But if we put this down to something like 0.2, we'll just give us a pretty good example, and let's rotate this 90 degrees like that. As you can see, we're getting a ton of displacement data, and this might not be necessarily too accurate. So what we can do first is just bump up those subdivisions. And then here's where the magic comes in. And again, this is dependent on whatever you're making. So don't follow this like to a T. This won't always be the best result. Before this, the white areas are actually what should be recessed. If you've ever seen a brick wall, the grout is kind of like pushed into the tile or the brick or whatever it is. So this data is kind of reversed. You can do this multiple ways. You can invert the entire map, or what I'm going to do is simply just do a negative value for the displacement. And now we get a brick wall. So again, this brick wall texture actually has no geometry in the way that you would like sculpt something. Again, this is what our actual geometry represents, is just these dots. So it's not necessarily going to be sculptable, but for background elements, this I think is more than enough. And again, this texture was made of just an image off of Google. So this is step one. Step one is learning how to use displacements to create geometry out of nothing, essentially. So step one, done. Option two now, sculpting. So let's go to sculpting. The first thing you're going to do is select something really big as your radius. Go to fall off and choose constant. The texture, and we are going to add a texture, the height map that we made before. If we go in here and click, you can see that we now have sculpted on top of our mesh. So we're getting that mesh data again, but it's kind of, it looked uncontrollable, right? Like there's something that's like not quite right there. And that's because we're using a tiled format and we're not really seeing what we're stenciling on top of. So what you're going to do, and this used to mess with me for the longest time, is you're going to go to this top menu and scroll down until you see mapping and switch that to stencil. Now you can see what we're doing. And if you just stay in one spot and right click, we can now move that map. And then we can also scale that map up and down with shift right click. So shift right click scales it up. So if we want the tiles to be bigger, we can make them bigger. If we wanted the tiles to be part of something, we can as well. So we're just going to scale that right on up, and we're going to move it down until it roughly takes the shape of the wall we have. We will click, and then again, we are now given the sculpt option. If we were to apply this, let's say, again, we have a ton of geometry, but if you scroll in, we're still using really clean topology. So this will help us with shading issues and adjustments later on if we want to resculpt on top of this. The first advantage should be kind of apparent. So in the viewport shading, we get the mesh, we know what it looks like, so we can plan around certain shots. Whereas sometimes with displacement, especially when you're displacing big things, you get kind of lost, right? Like you'll have the camera be in a spot and it looks like the camera shot's going to be good, but then when you add the displacement, you know, you could have something like a rock jet out more than you thought, and you have to re-go in and fine-tune. But the bigger thing that we can do is we can sculpt on top of this, which is a huge advantage and is something that we're going to address in option 3. So I'm going to make a cube, and this will kind of take techniques we learned in both of the other ones. One, we want the UV mapping from option 1, but we want the sculptability from option 2. And this is something that I will expand upon in a follow-up video and show you guys like all the different things you can do with this, but this is just a beginner tutorial, so we won't go too crazy. So first, let's subdivide this cube up a bunch. And then we're going to come in here and add a multi-resolution modifier once again. Subdivide it 5 times, shade it smooth. We're going to add a texture. The UV mapping is a little weird, so we are going to switch this to our UV editor, and we will simply just click and select all of them, or click A, rotate that 90 degrees. We're not too terribly worried about the top. So this is something similar to kind of what the original was looking like. The problem is, again, when I click tab, I can't necessarily sculpt on it the way that I want. If I were to sculpt this, I could essentially only bring like individual vertices, and it would look something, obviously it wouldn't look this bad, but I'm basically just like moving the mesh, and I'm not actually like altering the fine details of the mesh. We are going to take away that displacement, and instead we want something a little bit more permanent. Let's combine the techniques and add a displacement modifier. We can actually use textures on this. So if we open this, and this is something that I did not know for the longest time. So let's use our height map as our texture. First problem, this doesn't look right. Like when we did the displacement before, it lined up to the UVs, so we know something is wrong. And if we were to go back into our modifier stack, we can actually see that the coordinates are set to local and they need to be set to UV. Like you see, we can't edit this displacement area because it doesn't exist. So all you have to do is go into the stack, and if I were to do 0.1 here, again, on our first technique, we got something like this. And if we just switch this to negative 0.1, you can see that the effect is very similar, right? We have some displacement happening here, and now we have some displacement happening here. And again, we can strengthen this if we want to something like 0.2. If we were to sculpt wall 1, what you would see is that, again, we aren't able to sculpt the actual brick texture. We're only able to sculpt what the brick texture is laid on top of. So when we go back to our layout, you can see that this isn't really what we want, right? If we were able to like smooth out a brick or something like that, or, you know, make a brick look like it caved in on itself or something like that, this isn't necessarily the best option for us. So instead of doing something like that, where we're altering the entire mesh as a whole, we can go to our cube. And again, the cube is just to show you, like, you know, this is technique 3. It's a little bit more fancy than just a wall, but this technically works if it's flat or not. And let's apply our modifier stacks. What this gives us is this. So similar to option 2, we now have a mesh that we can go in and edit. But for example, like you see how there's like these strange creases here? If we go over to our sculpting, they're not as noticeable. But let's say, for example, I wanted to smooth these sections out. I can do that, right? That brick is smooth, that brick is smooth, that brick is smooth, that brick is smooth. Let's say I wanted one brick to look like part of it had been chipped away and was a little bit farther back. I could do something like this, and obviously, again, that's not going to look the most realistic, but we're not going for realism right now. We're just trying to prove a point. So again, we can do a bunch of things in this mode that we can't in the other modes. So with Way 3, this opens a whole new path of possibilities, and just being able to see it in the viewport alone is amazing. I love that personally. But if we don't apply the modifier stack, it still gives us options, but applying it gives us that flexibility to then sculpt on top of it. In the follow-up video, I'm actually going to show you guys how I make full models out of this technique. But I hope that was informative. I'd like to give a huge shout out to the Patreon members. One of the Patreon members actually selected this video as their topic, and I thought it was a great idea, so I ended up making a full tutorial out of it. If you have any questions or anything you want to share with me, comment on this video or on any of our other social media platforms. As always, Discord link is in the bio. Like, comment, subscribe if you like the video, and I'll try to come back with the follow-up later this week. Thanks!